Alvin, we talked yesterday morning, the 45th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, about such things as, well, first of all, your big, I'm searching for the proper adjective to describe it, but your idea, your concept, your thought about the sanctification of Hiroshima.
Crazy, perhaps.
Well, I doubt seriously it's crazy, but it's certainly something that I've thought about a lot, and I think a lot of people will continue to think about a lot. I haven't quite found the proper word for it. And we talked then about your sort of hindsight on the current waste problems that we have here, and how your role at the laboratory evolved. I'd like to do kind of a conscious shift right now from gown to town. And I'd like to talk about something that I've heard you criticize for over the years, primarily here in the business community, and that is that as far as transferring the technology of the laboratory into the private sector, that you were, well, that you were maybe sort of carried kicking and screaming into the idea of technology transfer. These are the severest terms I've heard it put in, and I just would like to hear your version of it.
I remember what the situation was at the time immediately after the war, when the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was acquiring its present structure and function. At that time, the laboratory's job was clearly the development of nuclear energy, which was, of course, a government monopoly. More than that, all of atomic energy was a government monopoly, and our primary responsibility was to pursue nuclear energy along the lines that the government, meaning the Atomic Energy Commission, approved and funded us for. Now, at that time, therefore, the whole idea of technology transfer from government operations to the private sector was not something that people really accepted. Our job was to do nuclear energy for the U.S. government. And therefore, we had rather strict rules about, in effect, using the government facilities and government money for the development of private enterprise. So that our general posture was, if you wish to spin off from the laboratory, then you were perfectly free to spin off from the laboratory, but you had to cut your relation with the laboratory. And as a matter of fact, the most successful of the spin-offs from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is, of course, Ortec, which later became EG&G, really happened a bit by fluke. I was out of town at the time that the people who organized Ortec approached one of the assistant directors and asked whether they could commercialize this technology, which had been developed at government expense within the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And the proposition that was laid before the management, I was out of town at the time, was that these people would stay at the laboratory, would use the technology, develop the technology at the lab, and then would transfer it to the new fledgling company. Had I been there, I would have said, well, if you want to do that, fine, but you have to separate yourselves from the laboratory. And the reason that we felt that way at the time was, first, that our business was not basically to encourage private enterprise in the Oak Ridge area or in the environs. But secondly, there is a difficult problem within the laboratory. You see, much of this development was done within the Instrument and Controls Division of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And what we observed was that, and the Physics Division, what we observed was that the people who organized Ortec, at least according to people within those two divisions who were not involved in Ortec, tended to separate themselves a bit from the rest of the people. And so we could see a kind of rivalry.
Themselves at laboratory,
yes,
in their work at the laboratory?
That things that were being done for that had commercial possibilities were somehow a little bit separate from things that were not of interest to the commercial company.
Or of their attention and more of their energy and thought.
They would have lunch together and discuss the Ortec business. And that began to present something of a morale problem within those two divisions because, well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but to some extent there developed a separation between the Ortec guys and the rest of the divisions. And it was on this account that I felt at the time that I was justified in my view of the matter, but that really had no more than rhetorical significance because we had made the promise to the Ortec people to go ahead as they did, and of course they went ahead, and Ortec has been an enormous success, extremely important as far as the Oak Ridge community is concerned, and looking at the matter from hindsight, 40 years later, 45 years later, it was apparent that my position was somewhat too rigid, but you must understand that the circumstances at that time were very different than the circumstances are today. Of course, now one of the jobs of the laboratories, all of the government laboratories, is to encourage this kind of privatization and spin-off. But that's really how the thing, why I suppose, acquired this reputation of being dragged kicking and screaming into the technology transfer era. Must remember that before I left the laboratory, I became quite enthusiastic about it, and we actually established an office of technology transfer. This was about 20 years ago. Fred Vonderlage was head of that office for quite a while.
Well, then what I'm hearing is that it would be very wrong to extrapolate from those particular circumstances at that time that you are lukewarm or other than enthusiastic about such things as increasing technology transfer and user facilities.
Yes, I think that's a great idea now. Didn't appear to be a great idea 45 years ago.
Let's talk about something else, you and the community, and that is the wonderful memorial to your late wife, Marge, Recording for the Blind. Could you tell us a little bit about how that evolved? Was that one of her special interests?
Well, not directly, but some of her best friends, Charmian Cohn and Tony Pleasanton, were very much involved with Recording for the Blind. And Tony, as a matter of fact, I think was the originator of the Oak Ridge chapter Recording for the Blind. And at the time of Marge's death, which is now more than 20 years ago, I began thinking now what would be an appropriate memorial for Marge. And I discussed the matter with some of Marge's family, most particularly an aunt of Marge, and she put up about half of the money for the memorial. Bill Pollard was very important in getting most of the rest of the money through a foundation in Chattanooga that he was familiar with, and the community also contributed a fair amount of money. But I'm very pleased about the building in particular. It's a gem of a building, and won an architectural recognition in one of the architectural magazines at the time that it was built. Might say that the late Epler was not the architect, but he was the chief engineer on the job, really, and helped a great deal in getting the thing going. And I'm very pleased about it.
Have you done any reading for Recording for the Blind?
No, I'm afraid not, but many of my friends have, and I know many of the people who are involved with it.
Is the program, I know it's very much ongoing. There's no problem with they're not lacking for readers. I guess what I'm saying is we're not, our generation isn't getting too old. I hope they have a steady supply of new readers. Are you keep in touch with it?
I don't really keep that closely in touch, but I think in many ways it's an admirable kind of activity for a scientific community with lots of retirees, because many of the books that are read are scientific. And the retirees, many of them who participate in the activities there, have the background and the knowledge and the reading voice to be very good readers and monitors.
Well, there was another project, community project, that you and Bill Pollard were very much identified with, which unfortunately did not work out so well, and I just wonder how you reflect on that. That was the Awareness House.
Yes. Well, you must realize that at the time that we got involved with the Awareness House, the drug problem was first coming to the fore, and many people in Oak Ridge had very personal contacts with young people who were being caught up and whose lives were being destroyed by drugs right here in Oak Ridge. And so I thought that it might be a good idea if we could get something going. And I was impressed by an article that appeared in Life magazine about the Awareness House movement. We got in touch with the people connected with the Awareness House. But I'm afraid it really wasn't very successful. We raised a fair amount of money. The house ran for several years, but I'm afraid we were a little naive, and the whole operation was not as successful as we would have hoped it to be.
Just as a matter of review, for some who might not remember, the Awareness House, of course, was located where now the Senior Center is located, and where earlier
one of the problems was that we should not have located it in such a public place, because it should have been in a much more secluded part of the town, rather than right on the turnpike where people could, see and criticize and so on. But just in general, I'm not unproud of the fact that I was involved in trying to do something. I'm unhappy that it didn't work out very well.
I think of you in the community to a significant degree on just the people that you've brought here. I remember particularly when Jean Weinberg, your wife's Payne Weber, was having an opening down on Tyrone Road. I remember it was the typical wine and cheese business opening, and I was invited and dropped in, and it was a Friday evening, I think, and there were no less, I believe, than 4 Nobel Prize winners there. There was a meeting there. I always thought this was something very special about Oak Ridge. I think that was Hans Bethe and George Kistiakowsky and Eugene Wigner, and I can't remember the other who attended that. Maybe the most auspicious, at least scientifically speaking, business ribbon cutting we've ever had in town.
Perhaps, although I should make a small correction, George Kistiakowsky never did win the Nobel Prize. I think there were that many Fermi Prize winners. George Kistiakowsky, though, was President Eisenhower's scientific advisor, and I got to know him quite well because I was a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee at the time that George Kistiakowsky was the science advisor. But Hans Bethe, of course, was a Nobel Prize winner as well as a Fermi Prize winner, as was Eugene Wigner.
Well, maybe I've forgotten someone. My memory is that there were at least 3 or 4. Maybe they were here for some meeting that you had, and you said, "Come on over and attend Gene's grand opening ceremonies." Alvin, I'd like to move now to. I, of course, remember very well, as many of us do, your annual State of the Laboratory talks, and I sort of, as looking back on those, I think virtually every one of those. And how many did you give? Did you give 17?
The laboratory, the research director, for some 20 years, and I began giving the talks while I was still a research director. So I think there were altogether about 20 such talks.
It's as I recall them, each one had a new idea. I think of things like big science and little science. You, I think, were one of the first people to advocate the laboratory doing work for agencies other than the Atomic Energy Commission, which was kind of a to some a revolutionary idea at the time. I identify you with the idea of mixing the physical and the social sciences, the hard and the soft sciences. I think of you in terms of course, one of your many terms that you're known for, technological fix. I think in one of those talks, at least some of us first became conscious of the idea of coal gasification. That whole idea. I believe you probably introduced your consciousness of the CO2.
Well, you realize that coal gasification certainly was not my invention. Been done for many years.
Well, my question is, just looking back on all of those and perhaps some of those other ideas that you introduced. Oh, the agro-industrial complex was another. How do you reflect on those? Which ones do you feel?
Well, some were good ideas, some were not so good ideas. Some were a bit naive. Let's talk about the agro-industrial complex. At the time, it looked like a pretty smart idea, and I think one of the people that was much involved in that was Phil Hammond, a very imaginative fellow who came to us from Los Alamos, and his argument was that if you make energy systems large enough, then they will become very cheap. That turned out not quite to be correct, and I suppose I was a bit enchanted by the notion that big is cheap rather than small is beautiful. Big turned out not to be cheap. At least at present it doesn't appear to be cheap, but that might change. And the notion of using nuclear energy for desalting was basically Phil Hammond's notion. He brought it to the laboratory just about the same time as the Six-Day War in 1967. And Lewis Strauss, who had been the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, but he then retired, became very interested in this possibility of using nuclear desalting in the Middle East as a means of achieving, well, getting more water for the Middle East and possibly solving the political problems of the Middle East that way. And he interested then ex-President Eisenhower in the idea, and the notion of building big desalting plants powered with nuclear energy in the Middle East became known as the Eisenhower Plan. And President Eisenhower, ex-President Eisenhower, very interested, and he put his prestige behind the idea. Actually, Senator Howard Baker became very interested, and he arranged for the U.S. Senate to pass a resolution called the Sense of the Senate resolution. It wasn't binding, but he did have the Senate pass a resolution saying that they would like to encourage the development of these ideas. And as the bureaucracy works, this finally got to the State Department. From the State Department of the Atomic Energy Commission, the laboratory was given a fair amount of money, I think it amounted to a few $1 million, to actually pursue the possibility and develop the notions of agro-industrial complexes for the Middle East. Cal Burwell was very influential, as was Irv Spiewak, in the design of these complexes. And we brought to the laboratory Israelis and Egyptians. It was almost the only place in the whole world where Israelis and Egyptian scientists were working together on a joint project. And some of our people visited the Middle East to look around and see what the situation was. Well, the upshot of the matter was that a 12-volume report was put out. I had occasion recently to look at the summary of the report, and it was rather an attractive idea, but unfortunately a little bit unrealistic, because we had assumed that the cost of nuclear energy would be lower than it actually turned out to be. Now, it is rather amusing that here it is some 18 years later, 20 years later, And you do see a few people who are interested, once again, in the possibility of desalting the sea on a large scale in the Middle East. I have a family interest in, as a matter of fact, because a grandnephew of mine is now studying the problem as a graduate student in hydrology and agronomy at the University of Wisconsin. And he contacted me just a few weeks ago asking for a copy of the summary, because at the University of Wisconsin they are doing studies along this line. Whether this will ever get anywhere, I don't know. I might say, though, that things change. For example, one of the proposals that went pretty far was the idea of building big desalting plants off the coast of California near the town of Irvine, about 2 miles offshore on what was called Bolsa Island. The idea was to build 2 big nuclear reactors and use the nuclear reactors for producing electricity and for producing 100 million gallons of water per day, which is really quite a large amount. Well, the project got pretty far, but then it foundered because it appeared to be too expensive. Here, 20 years later, with California suffering one of the most severe droughts that it has ever suffered, 5 years with less than normal rain, you hear people saying once more, well, maybe we ought to look at the question again. But I sometimes have the feeling, a bit of an I told you so attitude, because had you built the reactors at that time, the cost of the reactors would seem to have been very high at the time, but looked at from the perspective of 20 years later, those reactors would have been very cheap, and you would have paid for them by now, and therefore the cost of the energy from them would be very, very low. And people forget that once you pay for a reactor, the reactor producing electricity is a gold mine for the utility, because all the operating costs are really very low. And so had they built Bolsa Island 20 years ago, it would have been a godsend. But of course, you cannot really see what the future...
Well, speaking of the future, we're talking here about 72 hours after Iraq has invaded Kuwait. Is there any relevance, indirect or direct?
Well, even Tom Wicker, who is a very liberal columnist, as you know, in his column yesterday, talking about the energy problem and the relation with the cutoff of oil and Iraq and so on, at the very end, he offered an opinion which is not very popular today among liberal circles. And he said that we must look at every energy alternative, and then he goes on to say, and as far as I am concerned, this does not exclude nuclear energy, that we really have to look once more at nuclear energy, and particularly nuclear energy based on this new generation of nuclear reactors that people are talking about that have passively safe features attached to them.
You said not popular among liberals. Aren't you a liberal?
I used to be much more of a liberal than I am now. I fear that the older I get, the more conservative I get. On some things, I suppose I'm liberal, and other things, I'm pretty conservative now.
What are you conservative about?
I guess, generally speaking, I am quite skeptical about government interventions helping on the average. In some cases, government interventions help. On the average, government interventions probably do more harm than good.
Does this apply to the development of nuclear power?
No, that's an exception.
Well, what are you still liberal on?
Well, I think that race relations have improved a great deal since the passage, the Supreme Court decision in the Brown case, which desegregated the schools, for example, said that separate was not equal, which had been the case in the Plessy decision of, 1890? Plessy versus Ferguson, correct, yeah.
Getting back to the ideas that you advanced in those State of the Laboratory talks, you said some were naive, some were better than others. Am I correct that you're placing the agro-industrial complex among the naive ones, even though little naive? Well, what of those ideas do you still feel very strongly about?
Well, I think I was correct in my assertion right from the beginning that we really should pursue the breeder reactor, because I don't really think that if one is truly honest about these matters, that the alternatives to nuclear energy, basically solar energy on a very large scale, or thermonuclear energy on a large scale, that they are all that likely to be full substitutes for fission energy, and we ought to get on with fission energy.
And you were liberal on the race issue. I mean, at least you totally supported civil rights. How do you assess your record on women, equal rights for women, equal employment for women, particularly at the laboratory, as you look back on that?
That's a bit complicated, and I'm embarrassed to say that in the old days, I used to say, by all means, hire women as administrators in the laboratory, as much as possible. And the explanation for it was one that would, I suppose, today qualify me as a bona fide male chauvinist pig. Because what I used to say was that you can get, remember this was 1948, you can get better brains in a woman for less money at that time than people accepted. And I said, of course, you should make the women the administrators. They are better. Well, you can get better brains for less money. Now, of course, that's kind of a male chauvinist pig kind of attitude today, implying that I thought it was right that they got less money. Today, of course, you can get better brains in women, but you have to pay them for it. So I'm all for women being, treated just like men.
What about scientists?
Scientists do, yeah. But particularly I had in mind that I thought that our administration of the laboratory would have been better on the average had we hired women to be the administrators rather than men. Because except for the very highest administrative jobs at the laboratory, the people that we were able to get to do the lesser administrative jobs, the men almost entirely, and white men for that matter, I don't think were as capable as many of the women around the laboratory who didn't have jobs like that.
We all went through the adjustments, the racial adjustments. Were there any particular problems or pains at the laboratory as far as making the adjustment? I remember I presume even the laboratory had the whites and the black fountains and restrooms.
Yeah,
and at
when
one
I came to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, you had white men, colored men, white ladies, colored women. You didn't call a colored woman a lady in those days. This was almost 50 years ago. The problem was solved really surprisingly easily at the laboratory because we had to repaint the laboratory one day, and the restrooms were repainted normally, and we simply crossed out white and colored, and we just had therefore twice as many facilities as were really needed, but that's the way it was done. But there were some people who objected, but it wasn't serious at the laboratory.
Well, we've sort of ranged a lot of subjects today. I look forward to talking to you again. I want to, in this next conversation, I want to talk about Alvin Weinberg, the presidential advisor, Alvin Weinberg, the bureaucrat, and a little bit about some of your national roles outside of Oak Ridge, if we may. And I thank you again for for today's conversation.
Thank you.